In the final days of summer in 1897, when the shadows grew long and the air took on the faint bite of the coming autumn, Belgrave Lane held the kind of quiet that made strangers feel watched. The Eastman residence sat at the far end, a proud three-story home of dark brick and white trim, its roof steep and clean, and its garden meticulously kept. By all outward signs, it belonged to a family of standing, people whose lives moved in measured, respectable rhythms. The townsfolk would nod toward its neat iron gates as they passed, remarking on its polished windows and the deep green of its hedges. They admired the way the place seemed untouched by the disarray that plagued other households, unaware that its perfection was not a product of virtue but of control. Behind the elegance was a house that had been taught to keep its secrets. Harold Eastman was a man of precision. His hair was always combed straight back, his suits were brushed free of lint, and his voice carried the steady tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His wife, Agnes, was his mirror in manner and appearance, calm, modestly dressed, with the unassuming charm that invited trust. Together they embodied the image of propriety that the neighborhood so loved to uphold. They attended church each Sunday, contributed to the parish fund, and offered small acts of charity that ensured no one could find reason to speak ill of them. But there was something in the way Harold's eyes seemed to measure every word spoken to him. Something in the way Agnes smiled without ever revealing her teeth, that left an unspoken distance between them and everyone else. The house itself carried an old air, not of decay but of endurance. The thick walls seemed to absorb the sounds of the outside world, holding its rooms in a muffled stillness. The smell inside was faintly medicinal, camphor and starch, clinging to the heavy curtains and carved banisters. Servants, when they were hired, never stayed long. They complained in whispers of feeling watched in empty rooms, of hearing faint tapping sounds from the lower floors at night, though they could never say where exactly the noise came from. And always, when they left, they were paid generously and quickly replaced. It was the cellar that anchored the house's reputation among those few who had seen it. To most, it was nothing more than a large dry space where food and coal were stored. But for those who had been sent down to fetch wine or bring up preserves, there was a feeling that did not end where it should. The light from the single oil lamp barely reached the far wall, and in the shadows there was always a sense of a door that ought not to be there. Though no one could ever remember its shape clearly when they tried, the walls bore patches of whitewash that seemed newer than the rest, as if they had been applied to hide something. The Eastmans did not entertain visitors often, but when they did, their hospitality was flawless. Guests were led into the front drawing room, where the fire burned low and the conversation never strayed to personal matters. They spoke of the parish, of crops, of small concerns. When the evening ended, Harold would escort the men to the front steps, while Agnes walked the women to the gate. No one ever saw more of the house than the Eastmans wished them to see. No one went upstairs without being invited, and no one, under any circumstance, was shown the cellar. It was Agnes who managed the day-to-day life within those walls, moving like a shadow through the rooms. Her presence was so constant that one could almost forget she was there, yet nothing escaped her notice. She was the one who ordered the linens boiled weekly, who ensured every surface shone, who kept the small jars of lavender oil on the mantels topped up. Harold, on the other hand, spent his time in the study when not away on business. The study door was always locked when he was inside. The sound of slow, deliberate hammering could sometimes be heard from there, followed by the metallic scrape of tools being set down. At night the lane would fall silent except for the occasional creak of the Eastman gate swinging in the wind. Inside, the house seemed to hold its breath. Footsteps moved in the halls long after the lamps had been extinguished, and the faint smell of camphor would grow stronger, as if drawn upward from the floors below. The neighbors never questioned the occasional late-night arrival of a covered wagon at the Eastman home, nor the way Harold would unload its contents himself under the dim light of a lantern. To them it was the business of a respectable man, nothing more. Yet there was a history to the property that no one in Belgrave Lane bothered to recall. Before Harold's uncle had lived there, the house had been the subject of quiet gossip. Odd deliveries in the night, rooms that were bricked up and then unsealed years later. The mysterious absence of records about the families who had once occupied it. When Harold inherited it, the whispers faded, replaced by admiration for his orderliness. People prefer a story they can understand, and the Eastmans gave them exactly that. An image of control free from the chaos that so often marked the lives of others. But the walls remembered. They remembered the faint cries that had been swallowed by thick plaster. They remembered the cold damp that seeped into the bones of those kept too long in the dark. And they remembered the footsteps, slow, deliberate, never hurried, of those who came to look upon what had been hidden away. In the late hours when the rest of Belgrave Lane slept, the house would hum faintly, as though its timbers and nails were settling into place around a truth that no one dared speak. The Eastmans slept soundly in their beds side by side, the silence between them unbroken. Tomorrow will be another day of polite smiles and careful routines. The cellar would remain locked, and whatever moved in the quiet beneath the floors would remain where it was, unseen, untouched, waiting. Morning thinned the dark over Belgrave Lane, and the Eastman house accepted it with its usual quiet pride. Harold rose before the church bell, wound each clock, tested every window latch, and paused in the study mirror long enough to correct the neat parting in his hair. The mirror, like the house, had belonged to his uncle. So had the small envelope tucked with the deed, its brittle paper rubbed smooth by long fingers. Never leave the lower door ajar. Never permit a servant to sleep on the basement level. And if a stranger asks about the coal room, speak of damp and rats and send them away. Harold did not read these as warnings, but as craft. They were the rules of a trade that valued patience, order, and the ordinary mask. He felt the house accept him the way a locked drawer accepts its proper key. He had lived elsewhere once, in rented rooms with thin walls and music from the street, but he had never felt well there. Other people moved too quickly. Their lives shook his sense of measure. When the funeral ended and the solicitor placed the deed in his hand, Harold walked the rooms of Belgrave Lane and recognized the shape of thought that had built them. The air held still in the stairwell. Linen smelled faintly of camphor. The floorboards did not complain. He descended to the cellar with the iron key and did not expect revelation. He expected readiness. He found it. Whitewash laid fresh on old brick, a run of board sanded to the same grain, hooks placed at a height that would mean nothing to a casual eye. A corridor that turned once and then offered a simple blank wall where a blank wall had no reason to be. The uncle had been a man of tidiness, and all tidy men understand that concealment is only storage done with more care. Harold stood in that stillness and did what he always did when something pleased him. He counted his breath. The renovations began in winter when wages were welcome and questions were fewer. Agnes kept the accounts, Harold the plans. The hired men were told the family desired a cooler store for preserves and a clean place to keep coal dust from food. Drawings showed a widened stair, a brace under the landing, and a double door at the bottom fitted with a sweep that kissed the stone and left no gap. Felt would be pressed into the jambs. Seams would be tarred. The foreman was required to count each iron nail and return the tally, a request he found tiresome but harmless. Along one wall, a bank of cabinets was ordered cedar-lined to deter moths, each with a simple brass pull and a number stamped on the inside lip. There was nothing here a decent house could not want, and that was the comfort of it. The men sanded, hammered, planed. Agnes brewed tea and sent down bread. Harold measured in silence and approved without praise. By dusk the stair felt heavier underfoot, as if it had decided to carry only the weight that belonged. Agnes left no speeches in her wake. She left arrangements. In the kitchen she boiled linen until the windows wept, dried it to a clean crackle, and stacked it in a tin-lined cabinet that locked with a bright little click. On a shelf she labeled glass bottles in the same soft hand she used for church notices. Camphor, laudanum, chloral, ether, and a thick amber syrup from a city chemist whose parcel carried no printed name. She stitched plain gowns from bleached muslin with wide ties that would not chafe. She ordered small combs with round teeth, nail scissors with blunt points, corked ear syringes, and a brass water clock whose slow drip taught any room the value of even time. She did this the way other wives planned suppers or mended socks, with the assurance of someone who believes care is its own kind of goodness. In a hidden panel of the desk, Harold found his uncle's letters written in a small, steady script that never strayed from the lines. They were not confessions. They were lessons made by patient trial. Panic is a tide and may be met with tide. A voice at an even pace will press it back. Stillness, once modeled and repeated, becomes a choice. A body will accept long quiet if the quiet is framed as safety. Moisture invites decay. Cold preserves obedience, but too much cold provokes shiver, and shiver wakes fear. One page warned against priests and visiting physicians who love disorders because it gives them something to cure. Another noted that people forgive what is done in the name of rescue, but not what is done in the name of desire. Harold copied the useful lines into a fresh ledger and burned the originals in the kitchen grate while Agnes stirred the ash until it looked like any other ash. By early spring, the house had absorbed the new rules as if it had always expected them. Harold kept 2 inspections, one at dawn and one at dusk. He paused at the top step with the key in his palm and listened for the right kind of nothing. A proper quiet had weight. A wrong quiet felt hollow, as if the air were preparing a word. If the balance was off, he waited until it settled. Agnes learned similar listening skills. From the draft under the kitchen door, she could tell whether the lower rooms held their breath or needed calming. She hummed when she carried the linen down. She did not hurry. Hurry is a language that teaches panic how to speak. When fittings were complete, they turned outward with baskets and coins. They visited the parish orphanage and allowed the matron to praise their goodness. Harold asked practical questions about ages and records and learning habits with a dry tone no one found unusual in a man who liked lists. Agnes watched for the careful ones, the children who kept their hands folded and matched a room's pace without being told. They did not prefer the sick. The sick invited inspections and pity in the wrong places. They preferred the quiet. Names went into the household book and in Cellar, the mirror, into another ledger kept behind the cedar bank on the cellar wall. The entries were tidy. A date, a height, a note about temperament, a line about how easily a lullaby carried. On a rain-bruised afternoon, the first boy arrived, shoes muddy, eyes quick in the way frightened eyes are quick. He was shown a tidy bedroom, a washstand, and a view of clean hedges. Warm tea steadied his hands. Agnes folded his old shirt and set a sprig of lavender on it. Harold wrote a neat line in the ledger and closed it. The lower door stayed shut, the seals unbroken, the corridor waiting the way a blank page waits for ink. Lamps went out one by one until the stairwell returned to hush. Nothing dramatic had happened. A child had been received in charity by respectable people in a respectable house. On Belgrave Lane the rain softened, the gutters emptied, and the neighbors thought kindly of the Eastmans as they drew their curtains. Below the floor, the program that the uncle began and Harold refined stood ready for its next motion, the one that would make absence look like rescue and rescue feel like sleep. And with that quiet step, the house was prepared for the first of its wards to simply disappear. By the following year, the Eastman home had become a favored destination for the parish's most promising orphans. Not the loud, ungovernable ones, but the shy children who kept their eyes lowered and their hands folded. The matron at the orphanage referred to Harold and Agnes as her saving couple, praising their patience and quiet manner. She spoke of them to benefactors, remarking that the Eastmans always took the children others overlooked. What she did not say, because she had not noticed, was that the Eastmans only ever took children in pairs. Never siblings, never those with living relatives who might visit, and never anyone above the age of 12. The parish recorded each transfer in its careful ink, a column of names followed by the date of fostering. But as the years passed, those same names grew faint in other ledgers. No correspondence arrived from the Eastman children, no school enrollments bore their marks. They were accounted for only in the pages of the parish book, which no one read for pleasure, and thus no one saw the gaps beginning to form. In the first weeks after arrival, each child was given a simple routine. They woke in a plain upstairs room washed with water that smelled faintly of lavender, ate porridge in the kitchen under Agnes's watch, and spent the day in small domestic tasks. There were no punishments for mistakes, only corrections delivered in a voice so even it seemed to smooth the air. Harold rarely spoke to them in those early days except to ask them to stand still for measurements, height, weight, arm span, which he recorded in his ledger in a hand that was neither hurried nor hesitant. He asked them to hold their breath as long as they could while he counted, then wrote the number beside their name without comment. The children thought this a peculiar game, though none were encouraged to laugh. Weeks later, the child would be taken ill. Never seriously, just enough to keep them upstairs for a day or two. A small glass bottle would appear on the bedside table, filled with a syrup so sweet it clung to the tongue. Agnes would sit with them, combing their hair, telling soft stories that had no endings. At night, Harold would check their temperature, touch his fingers to their eyelids, and count their pulse with the tips of his cool hands. The child would drift in and out of sleep, waking less often each day. Eventually, they would not wake at all, though their chest would still rise and fall in slow, even motions. When the day came to move them, Harold carried them in his arms as though they were only sleeping. Agnes followed with a folded gown and a jar of lavender oil. Down the main stair, across the hall, through the narrow cellar door, the one no servant had ever opened without permission, and into the cool below. The cedar cabinets along the wall had been altered since the builders left. Each was fitted with a cushioned drawer, lined with linen just wide enough for a small body to lie without turning. The air was heavy with camphor, dry enough that it seemed to drink the damp from the skin. Harold would lower the child into the drawer, tucking the linen close around their sides, securing the ties of the gown so no sleeve rode up. Agnes would dab a drop of lavender oil under each ear, smoothing the hair so it lay flat. Then the drawer would be slid shut, the latch pressed down, and the key turned. The first few times Harold checked the drawers every hour, listening for breath. Later he learned the rhythm of the stillness and no longer needed to listen so closely. The drawers kept their charges safe from the noise of the world above. Weeks might pass without him opening one. When he did, the child inside would be unchanged, eyes closed, skin pale but warm, hair lying in the same perfect pattern it had when the drawer was shut. In Harold's mind, this was proof of the work's success. The child was neither lost to decay nor forced into the errors of growing up. They were preserved in what he believed was their most perfect form, unspoiled, compliant, silent. Back in town, questions were rare. The parish matron, when asked about a particular child, would say the Eastmans had taken them on permanently, or that they had moved away for the child's betterment. She spoke with such certainty that no one thought to check. On rare occasions when a distant relative appeared, Harold would produce a letter, written in an uncertain, childish hand, explaining that the child had gone to work on a farm or found a place in another household. The letter would be smudged, as if written in haste, and signed with the child's name. It was always enough. There were moments when the silence between disappearances seemed to stretch too long, and Harold would grow restless. He would walk the cellar, inspecting the wood for signs of swelling, adjusting the brass pulls so they turned without squeaking, checking the seals for any hint of draft. Agnes noticed this restlessness and would remind him in her measured way that patience was the truest mark of care. She believed this without hesitation. To her, the children were not gone. They were simply kept as one might keep fine linens or rare books, untouched by wear, waiting for the right occasion. By the turn of the century, the Eastmans had fostered 18 children. None had returned to the parish. None had been seen by neighbors after the day of their arrival. Yet the Eastmans' reputation only grew. At Christmas, the church gave them a place of honor in the front pew. The vicar spoke of their generosity, their tireless work for those in need. Harold and Agnes bowed their heads, their faces serene, their hands folded in the same stillness they had taught their wards. The congregation saw only kindness. The house on Belgrave Lane saw only continuity, the quiet passing of another year in which the drawers below remained full, and the air within them held its unbroken, obedient calm. The door to the lower rooms did not open with drama. It sighed, as if the house allowed entry only to those who would not disturb its breath. A narrow stair sank into pale light that made every edge look clean. Harold counted each step not for luck but for order, while Agnes followed with folded linen and a small glass bottle whose scent moved ahead like a guide. With each turn the air cooled and sound thickened until even a heartbeat seemed padded. At the bottom stood a double door fitted so close to the stone that no draught could pass. Felt lined the jambs. A bar lay across two iron hooks that had been rubbed with wax so they made no noise at all. When Harold lifted the bar and pressed the latch, the second door received them with a hush so complete it felt like a hand over the mouth of the room. The chamber beyond was long and exact, whitewashed from floor to ceiling so the eye could not claim a corner. Along both walls ran a bank of wooden fronts that looked at first glance like ordinary cabinets. Each had a brass pull dull from much polishing, and a small number cut into the wood with a steady hand. They were all the same size, a sameness that comforted the mind that loved order and unsettled the one that noticed what size it was. Between the banks stood a narrow table set with plain tools, a block of soap, a dish of pins, a bone comb, scissors with blunt tips, a cloth tape, a water clock that dripped one patient drop at a time, and a metronome that beat the room into an even breath. In the corner, a chilled pipe whispered gave up its cool to a set of thin channels under the floor and never rattled. Nothing here suggested haste. Nothing here suggested pain. Yet the purpose of the place stood in the line of the brass pulls in the way each number waited for another. Harold slid a drawer with 2 fingers. It moved without scraping. Inside lay a shallow bed built with the care of a cradle and the logic of a box. Linen rested over flax stuffing that held shape without weight. A small pillow cupped the neck so the jaw could not sag. Soft leather tabs crossed the chest and hips like quiet hands, not to fight a body that struggled, but to remind a body that movement was no longer asked of it. At the head, a narrow slit admitted a faint stream of cooled air. At the foot, another slit drew it away so breath would not grow heavy. Under the pillow, a pouch of charcoal waited like a mute guardian against dampness. Lavender, wrapped in gauze, tucked beneath the ears, promised the nose a safe world. The design did not flatter impulse. It honored duration. Agnes kept the washstand ready. She trimmed hair to a length that would not snarl. She filed nails round so no edge could scratch a cheek and break the lesson. She warmed water and pressed cloths over eyelids until the lids accepted their work. A trace of salve eased the nostrils so each slow breath slid without sound. If a brow knit, she smoothed it with a thumb and waited for the line to forget itself. If a throat was swallowed, she waited for the swallow to pass, then counted along with the metronome until the 2 agreed. Harold tended the measures. He learned how cold could invite a shiver that dragged a child back through layers of sleep like a hook was wrong, and how still air taught sweat and sores, which were worse, and how sudden sound spiked the breath and shattered the pattern that took so long to teach. So he kept the cold mild, the air moving and the noise outside, as if the door itself were a tutor that turned trouble away. His ledger did not write names after the first days. It wrote numbers, dates, weights, and the length of a held breath, as if identity were a threat to the method. He believed the room should speak only the language of care. The act itself looked tidier. A child softened by syrup and an even voice came down as if for rest after a fever. The drawer opened, the linen received a small weight, the tabs settled, the pillow found the curve of the neck, and the gauze parcels shared their calm. Harold watched the ribs settle into the beat of the metronome. He checked the pulse and let the drop of the water clock call minutes into shape. Then the drawer slid home and the latch kissed the brass. The world outside lost one voice without knowing it had been there. Sometimes he stood with his palm over the head slit and felt the thin, warm exhale brush his skin. He told himself the warmth proved goodness. They were alive, and life that does not wander cannot be ruined. Sometimes Agnes sat on the stool and hummed a tune with no high notes, a road without hills, so the ear would learn that nothing was expected. She thought of the street above where boys shouted and grew into men who shouted, louder, and she felt the rightness of keeping small things small. The chamber gave them back their own beliefs in a gentle echo. If mercy could be measured, it would look like this, Harold thought. Order without end. And yet the cruelty stood plain in the choice at the room's heart. It was not a blow or a mark. It was the decision to hold a living thing at the edge of itself and call that edge peace. Time flattened here. Days did not pass. They pooled. The numbers on the drawers rose to meet the ledger. The cold pipe whispered on. The metronome counted one long breath that never finished. When Harold slid the white panel across the hidden hinges and turned the plain key, the bricks resumed the face of any wall, and the house above resumed its good manners. Above, Belgrave Lane smiled while the drawers waited in silence. Harold Eastman did not think of himself as a man who harmed. He thought of himself as a man who refined. The cellar was his workshop, but it was also in his mind a laboratory, a place where he could perfect the art of holding life at a chosen point. The methods he employed were neither accidents nor improvised cruelty. They were the result of years of reading, note-taking, and deliberate testing. In his study behind the ledgers of household accounts, he kept volumes on refrigeration, mortuary science, the physiology of sleep, and the uses of various chemical sedatives. Many of these were not intended for public purchase. They came from suppliers who sold to hospitals, morgues, and in one case an asylum on the outskirts of London. The key to his work, Harold believed, was balance. Too much of any one force, cold, stillness, chemical restraint, could tip a subject from preservation into death, and death was, in his view, a failure. His goal was to keep each child's body hovering in a state where no growth, no decay, and no will to move could disrupt the symmetry. It was a state he called perfect stasis. The human body, he had learned, could be coaxed into such a state through a triad of control: temperature, chemical sedation, and sensory minimization. Each worked alone, but together they formed a system that was more reliable than any one measure. The cooling system beneath the cellar floor was a crude adaptation of the refrigeration techniques used for meat storage. Harold had modified it so the air never dropped to the point of visible breath. Instead, it remained cool enough to slow circulation without inducing shivering. Shivering was the enemy. It woke the mind and called on muscles, wasting precious energy. To prevent this, he tested and retested the pipework, measuring with a thermometer imported from Germany, making small adjustments until the air carried just enough chill to be felt, but not enough to stir the skin. Sedation was Agnes's domain. She was the one who prepared the syrup, carefully measuring doses so that a child would drift into the desired depth without slipping away entirely. She learned to read the signs. A twitch of the fingers meant the dose was too light. A tightening of the jaw meant it was too heavy. She would adjust with a drop of laudanum or a weaker sugar mixture, always keeping the rhythm steady. Harold trusted her with this part because she was unerring in her patience. A miscalculation could undo months of careful conditioning, and Agnes never miscalculated. The final element, sensory minimization, was perhaps the most important. Harold had come to understand that the human mind is tethered to the world by sound, touch, and light. Remove those threads and the mind retreats into itself, losing track of time and movement. The drawers were lined with linen not only for comfort but to deaden any echo. The only sound within was the slow beat of the water clock and the metronome when it was used. Sounds so regular they faded into the mind's own pulse. The touch of the straps across the body was so light it did not restrain, only reminded me. As for light, there was none once the drawer was shut. In darkness, days could not be counted. Harold tested the system on short intervals at first. A child would spend a day in the drawer and then be returned to the upstairs room where Agnes would keep them quiet with simple tasks. Gradually, the intervals lengthened. 2 days, 4, then a week. By the time a child remained in the drawer without waking for a full month, Harold considered them successfully preserved. From that point, there was no more need for rotation. The drawer became their permanent place. He documented each case with the detachment of a researcher. Respiration rate, skin temperature, weight at intervals, and always the stillness of the expression. He took pride in the fact that none of his subjects bore signs of distress. There were, however, failures. On 3 occasions, a child awoke unexpectedly, gasping and clawing at the linen. One tore free of the straps before Agnes could soothe them. Harold noted each failure in the ledger and marked the cause in neat script. Temperature drop, dose misjudged, drawer latch imperfect. The last was remedied with new brass fittings imported at expense. In each case, once calm could not be restored. Harold took steps to ensure the child could not return to full wakefulness. The method for this was quick and left no marks. A pressure at the base of the skull, a held breath, a silence. He did not dwell on these incidents. They were simply losses in the pursuit of a greater method. The cellar, with its perfect rows, became more than a hidden room. It became a proof of concept. Harold believed that if such preservation could be applied on a larger scale, it could spare countless children from the corruptions of the world. Poverty, cruelty, the slow erosion of innocence. The fact that the world would never understand was of no consequence to him. Some truths, he thought, must remain in the hands of those capable of bearing them without sentiment. Above, Belgrave Lane continued its quiet life. Neighbors saw the Eastmans walking together to church, Harold carrying his prayer book, Agnes with her gloved hands folded. The house remained immaculate. No sound, no smell, no hint of the cellar's workings ever reached the street. And in the cool, dry dark below, Harold's science moved forward, one measured breath at a time. The White Room was not part of the original cellar. It had been added after Harold realized that preparation was as important as preservation itself. The room sat between the main cellar and the hidden chamber of drawers, sealed by a plain wooden door that could be mistaken for a broom closet. Inside, every surface, floor, walls, and ceiling, was painted in lime white, the kind that glowed faintly in lamplight and reflected every movement with unnatural clarity. The effect was deliberate. There could be no shadows here, no corners in which imperfection might hide. This was the room of cleansing, the place where a child was stripped of the final marks of the world above. It began with silence. Agnes would lead the child inside, closing the door gently and guide them to a low stool placed in the very center. She spoke little, and when she did, it was in the same tone one might use to ask a child to sit still for a portrait. A tin basin stood on a small table nearby, filled with warm water steeped in crushed lavender and a trace of camphor. She would wash the child's face first, then the hands, then the feet, moving with the patience of a woman shelling peas. Every motion was deliberate, every cloth pressed with equal weight. Clothing was removed next, folded neatly on the table as though it would be returned later. Though in truth, it never was. Agnes would inspect each garment for soil, hair, or loose threads, making notes in her small book. Hair was combed out, freed of tangles, and then trimmed to an even length, short enough that it would not curl or knot against the linen pillow. Fingernails and toenails were clipped and filed until no edge remained. The cuttings, along with any loose hair, were collected in a small ceramic jar with a fitted lid. Agnes claimed this was to prevent vermin, but Harold understood it differently. Nothing of the child should remain loose in the world. Once the physical tidying was complete, Agnes dressed the child in one of the plain linen gowns she sewed in the upstairs parlor. The fabric was bleached to a colorless white, the seams hand-stitched, so they lay flat against the skin. Wide ties crossed at the back, leaving no buttons or hooks to press into the body. The gown had no pockets, no ornament, nothing that could catch or fray. It was, in every sense, a uniform, a garment that erased individuality and replaced it with uniform stillness. Harold would enter then, ledger in hand. He recorded the child's measurements once more, even if they had been taken only days before. He counted the pulse, watched the rise and fall of the chest, and held his watch to measure the length of a single held breath. He would note any small tremors or restlessness, marking them in a code only he understood. Then came the syrup, a carefully measured spoonful that the child swallowed without protest under Agnes's calm gaze. After the syrup came the quiet wait. The child sat on the stool, eyes blinking slower with each minute, head dipping and lifting as the weight of drowsiness began to press down. Harold and Agnes did not speak during this part. They simply observed as one might observe the settling of snow after a storm. When the moment was right, when the eyes no longer tracked movement, when the shoulders had released their tension, Harold would lift the child in his arms and carry them through the inner door. The white room was then cleaned immediately. Agnes scrubbed the stool, washed the basin, and replaced the linen on the table. Any stray threads or drops of water were wiped away until the floor gleamed once more. The ceramic jar holding the hair and nail clippings was sealed and placed in the small cupboard in the corner, where others like it were kept. Each jar was labeled with a number corresponding to the drawer where the child would be placed. In this way, the white room became a kind of antechamber, not only to the cellar's stillness, but to the final erasure of the self. Over time, Harold began to think of the white room as a place of transformation. The children entered as they had been, marked by the world, bearing its traces, and left as he intended them to remain forever, unmarked, perfected, prepared for preservation. Agnes thought of it as a mercy. She said that the world above was a noisy, dirty place, and that it was only right to give a child one last moment of cleanliness before granting them rest. The ritual never varied. Every child passed through it in the same order, under the same light, in the same silence. Harold believed that this consistency was the reason for his success. Just as the drawers kept life in place, the white room removed anything that could disturb that stillness later. It was a final kindness, one that no one but the Eastmans could understand, and one that no one outside their locked doors would ever see. Agnes Eastman had never thought of herself as secondary in her marriage. Harold might have been the one with the ledger and the plans, but it was her presence that kept the work whole. Without her, the cellar would have been a place of raw procedure. Functional, perhaps, but lacking the gentle hands that disguised cruelty as care. She was the quiet constant, the voice that never rose, the touch that made surrender seem like an act of trust rather than defeat. If Harold was the architect, Agnes was the keeper of the walls, tending to every surface so the structure would never show a crack. Her days began in the kitchen before the sun touched the lane. She boiled water, measured syrup, and checked the supply of laudanum and ether. She mixed the solutions with a chemist's precision, stirring until they were indistinguishable from harmless cordials. It was Agnes who decided when a child was ready for the white room, not Harold. She could see it in their eyes, the moment when fear dulled into compliance, when the natural twitch of rebellion stilled into a watchful quiet. She called it the settling, and it was only then that she would prepare the gown, warm the basin, and lead them downstairs. Agnes believed she was doing something no one else dared, protecting children from the corrosion of the outside world. She had seen what happened to those who left the orphanage for factory work, the streets, or worse. In her mind, the cellar was not a tomb but a sanctuary, one that preserved them in the softest moment of their lives. It was a conviction so deep that she never questioned the morality of the drawers. If anything, she thought of them as safer than any bed above ground. She was also the one who soothed them when the method faltered. If a child stirred in the drawer, Agnes would be there before Harold, leaning close, her voice a low hum. She knew songs with no sharp turns, melodies that drifted like warm air over a sleeping face. She spoke as though she were telling a secret to someone already half in a dream. Sometimes she would rest her hand lightly on a chest or shoulder, feeling the breath until it matched the rhythm she set. On the rare occasion when fear returned, she would take the child into her lap as she had done in the first days, rocking them until their resistance melted away. Only when she was certain the stillness had returned would she signal Harold to close the drawer again. Her attention extended to the smallest details of the cellar. She checked the seals on the drawers daily, ensuring that no draft disturbed the balance of air. She replenished the lavender sachets every fortnight, never letting the scent fade enough for the mind to notice. She washed and re-waxed the leather straps so they would never chafe. Even the metronome and water clock were dusted and inspected as though they were part of the children themselves. Above ground, Agnes maintained the image that allowed everything below to remain hidden. She attended parish meetings, baked for church events, and visited the orphanage to deliver blankets and preserves. Her soft manner and unwavering composure made her untouchable in the eyes of the community. When she smiled, people trusted her without thinking. It was a skill she cultivated with the same care she used in the White Room, a mask so perfect it felt like her true face. There were times when Harold's focus narrowed too much, when he treated the children as figures in an experiment rather than living bodies. In those moments, Agnes would step in. She reminded him, not with words but with her presence, that the success of their work depended on keeping the illusion of care intact. She would adjust a pillow, smooth a crease in the gown, or stroke a cheek until the child's expression returned to calm. She was the bridge between the method and its subject, the thread that made the cruelty seamless. It was Agnes, too, who kept the jars in the cupboard of the White Room. She never explained why she guarded them so closely, but Harold suspected she thought of them as proof of the children's existence. The hair, the nails, the small physical remnants that the drawers erased. She polished the lids and kept the labels legible as if one day they might be needed. Whether for remembrance or for order, Harold never asked. In truth, Agnes's role was more than partnership. It was governance. She decided which child would come next, how long each would remain above before entering the drawer, and when, if ever, a drawer should be opened again. Harold might have designed the system, but Agnes ensured it breathed. And because she never doubted the righteousness of their cause, she was capable of carrying out every step without hesitation. To the outside world, she was a model of charity and devotion. Inside the Eastman house, she was the quiet hand that pressed the world away and kept it from touching what she believed should remain untouched forever. The ledger was kept in Harold's study in a drawer that was locked with a brass key worn smooth from decades of use. It was not the same ledger that held the neat lists of names and measurements for the parish to see. This one was heavier, bound in dark leather that had dried and cracked along its edges. Its pages were thick and stiff, each ruled in faint ink that had long since browned. On the spine, in small block letters, was a word that revealed nothing. Observations. Inside, the entries were meticulous. Dates were written at the top of each page, followed by the child's assigned number, never their name. Beside that, Harold recorded measurements in columns. Height, weight, temperature at the moment of placement, respiration rate. Then came the notations in his small, compressed hand. Drawer 7, day 4. Breathing steady, no twitching. Drawer 3, day 11. Right hand clenched, corrected by strap adjustment. Drawer 12, day 2. Slight nasal blockage, resolved with camphor oil. It was the kind of writing that stripped away the human shape of its subject, leaving only the outlines of an object under study. But there were other entries, ones that did not follow the tidy rhythm. These were marked in the margin with a single letter, F, and they carried a different weight. Drawer 5, day 3, eyelids fluttered, subject awoke, resisted. Reapplied syrup ineffective, terminated. Drawer 2, day 17, mottling on left cheek, likely condensation failure, subject expired. Drawer 9, day 1, pulse irregular, believed prior illness, disposed of remains by orchard burial. There was no emotion in these notes, no hesitation in the choice of words. To Harold they were necessary failures, each one a lesson for refinement. At the back of the ledger was a section Agnes had never touched, though she knew it existed. Here Harold recorded what he called structural postmortems. When a preservation failed and the child could not be revived, he would open the drawer and under the dim light of the cellar lamp, examine the body for signs of what had gone wrong. Sometimes it was a failure of the cooling system, moisture pooling at the base of the drawer, or too much dryness causing the skin to crack. Other times it was chemical imbalance, a misjudged dose that dulled the breathing beyond retrieval. He wrote about these with the same precision as the living cases, noting changes in skin tone, muscle stiffness, and even the smell, which he described in blunt terms. Sour onset of decay, or sweet indicating internal fermentation. In the earliest years he had disposed of the failed subjects quietly, burying them in the orchard at the back of the property during the cold months when the ground was firm enough to keep scavengers away. But over time the number of these small graves grew and Harold worried about the risk of discovery. He began to use lime, mixing it into the soil until nothing remained but brittle fragments that could be scattered without trace. The ledger recorded these too. Drawer 4, orchard disposal with lime, no remains visible. What was most disturbing in the ledger were the rare notations that strayed from the clinical voice. In one entry beneath the observations for a failed case, Harold had written, "Eyes remained open at the final moment, held gaze until stillness returned. Interference is unpleasant." In another, subject attempted speech, could not discern words, termination swift. These lines stood out like cracks in the wall, brief glimpses of the humanity that Harold otherwise erased. Agnes never read these pages, but she knew their weight. She would see Harold at the study desk late into the night, the oil lamp casting a sharp circle of light over the open ledger. His pen moved steadily, his face unreadable. When he closed the book, he would always lock it before extinguishing the lamp, as if sealing away something more dangerous than the cellar itself. The ledger was more than a record. It was the true history of the Eastman house, a history that could never be shown. If the White Room was the place of transformation and the drawers were the place of stillness, the ledger was the place of truth. A truth written without compassion, without remorse, and without any expectation that it would ever be read by another living soul. The winter of 1902 brought with it a pale sun and a sharper wind, and with it came Dr. Lionel Carow, a cousin on Harold's mother's side, a man whose name had been only faintly present in family letters until the sudden death of a shared relative in London. Lionel arrived not unannounced but uninvited, carrying with him the distinct air of someone accustomed to crossing thresholds without permission. He was a physician of some repute in the city, known for his interest in obscure ailments and experimental treatments, and though his work had earned him both respect and suspicion, he carried himself with the easy assurance of a man confident in his intellect. Harold met him at the door, taking his gloved hand briefly and leading him into the front room where the fire was kept low. Agnes appeared a moment later, her expression as composed as ever, and offered tea without asking if he wanted it. She did not like visitors who watched the way Lionel watched, eyes moving not just across faces but over the edges of rooms, noting what was absent as much as what was present. The conversation at first was about the inheritance Lionel had come to discuss, a modest sum and a few personal effects. But it soon shifted. Lionel asked about the house, about its history, about the uncle who had lived there before Harold. He remarked on the fine condition of the woodwork, the lack of dust in the corners, the way the air inside was cooler than the air outside despite the winter fire. He smiled when Harold explained this as good insulation, but the smile was thin and without warmth. On the second evening after supper, Lionel asked for a tour of the house. Harold hesitated, just long enough for it to be noticed, and then agreed, leading him through the formal rooms, the kitchen, the upstairs corridors. Lionel's questions were casual on the surface, but his eyes lingered on every locked door, every freshly painted wall. When they reached the door to the cellar, Harold's hand moved to guide him past it. "Just coal and storage," he said. "Not much to see." But Lionel paused, one hand resting on the latch, his gaze fixed on the faint scuff marks on the floorboards before it. He did not open the door. He simply nodded and followed Harold back to the front room. That night, long after the house had gone still, Lionel rose from the guest room and moved silently down the hall. Agnes, who slept lightly, heard the faint shift of the floorboards and was at the stair before he reached it. She did not ask where he was going. She only said, "You'll wake the house." Her tone was mild, but something in her eyes made him step back. In the morning, he said nothing of it. On the third day, Lionel's questions grew bolder. He spoke of cases in the city, children disappearing, found later in conditions so strange the authorities could not explain them. He asked Harold if he had heard of such things. Harold replied with a shrug and changed the subject. Agnes did not look up from her sewing, but she was listening to every word. That afternoon, Lionel found his way into Harold's study while Harold was in the yard. He opened drawers, leafed through the visible ledgers, tapped at the desk's panels with his knuckles. He found nothing. The dissection ledger was locked away and the key was never left in sight. When Harold returned, Lionel was standing by the window, remarking on the orchard. The visit ended without confrontation. Lionel took the train back to London, the matter of the inheritance settled. But in the days that followed, Agnes noticed Harold's unease. He began inspecting the cellar twice as often, checking the seals, tightening the drawer latches. Agnes suggested they move two of the older drawer's occupants to new positions in case the cellar ever had to be opened unexpectedly. Weeks later, a letter arrived from Lionel. polite, formal, but ending with a sentence that neither Harold nor Agnes could ignore. "You have something there that would interest me professionally. I will be returning in spring." It was not a threat in writing, but both read it as one. Harold placed the letter in the fire without a word. From that moment, the Eastmans understood that their quiet work had drawn its first true attention from the outside world. The cellar, once a private sanctuary, had become a place they might have to defend, not with force, but with the same precision and control they applied to everything else. Lionel's interest was a loose thread, and loose threads had to be either woven in or cut away. The winter of 1904 was the coldest in memory, a season that gripped the Eastman house in frost and silence. Snow buried Belgrave Lane in uneven drifts, muffling every sound but the groan of settling timbers. The orchard stood skeletal under the weight of ice, its black branches clawing at a pale, unbroken sky. For Harold, the deep freeze was a blessing. The cold air would aid the preservation in the cellar, reducing the strain on the pipe system. But by mid-January, the cold turned against them. It began quietly, as all their troubles did. One morning, Harold noticed the metronome in drawer 6 ticking faintly slower, as though the air had thickened. The cooling system, which normally whispered without pause, made a wet, uneven hiss. A pipe somewhere in the network had frozen. At first, he thought it a minor fault, a blockage that would clear as the day warmed. But the temperature in the chamber dropped too far, too quickly. By the following dawn, the stillness he prized had shifted. Shivering had begun in 3 drawers. Shivering was dangerous. It meant the body was trying to reclaim itself, pulling heat from the core, forcing blood to move faster. If it continued, Harold knew it would trigger consciousness. The syrup would be useless against it. The body would fight, and fighting would break the months, even years of stillness he had built. He and Agnes worked in near darkness to try to correct it, hauling buckets of hot water down the narrow stairs to pour into the intake cistern, wrapping sections of exposed pipe in cloths dipped in boiling water. But the blockage did not yield. On the 3rd night, the air in the chamber changed. The lavender could no longer mask the faint sour note that drifted up from the lower rows. Harold opened drawer 9 to inspect the cause. The child inside, small, no older than 10, was damp along the hairline, the skin under the eyes discolored to a faint green-gray. Condensation had pooled beneath the linen and seeped into the stuffing. In the cold, it had not evaporated. Instead, it had begun to turn the body. Harold felt the air leave him in a slow exhale. This was not something he could reverse. He closed the drawer without speaking and turned to Agnes. She already knew. The scent in the air was one she had encountered only twice before in all their years of work. It meant the chamber was compromised, not just a single drawer, but all of them. Even those that appeared intact were at risk. The cold had shifted the balance, and the delicate thread between preservation and decay had frayed. The next day they began the task neither had spoken aloud: removal. Each child was lifted from their drawer, their bodies inspected with the same methodical care used in placement. Some were still untouched, their skin smooth and cool, their breath shallow. Others bore the early signs: a darkening of the lips, a faint softening at the joints. These could not be saved. Harold noted each condition in the ledger, his handwriting as steady as ever. Agnes moved between them, replacing lavender sachets for those who could remain, wrapping the others in linen for transport. They worked through the night, carrying the wrapped forms through the narrow corridor to the orchard. The ground was frozen to the hardness of stone, but Harold had prepared for this eventuality years earlier. In a far corner, beneath the largest of the bare apple trees, was a covered pit. Deep, dry, and lined with lime. One by one, the bodies were lowered into it. Agnes did not speak as she poured more lime over them, her face expressionless under the lantern light. When the last had been laid to rest, Harold covered the pit with its wooden lid and shoveled snow over it until the ground looked untouched. By the time they returned to the cellar, the air was clearer, though the scent of rot lingered in the seams of the drawers. Harold ordered the metronomes reset, the linen replaced, the pipes inspected daily until the blockage eased. But he knew the chamber had lost something, a sense of perfection, a confidence in its own control. The failure would be written in the ledger, sealed between the covers like all the others. Yet the knowledge of it would remain in the walls. That winter left its mark on the Eastmans. Harold's inspections grew harsher, his tolerance for risk smaller. Agnes, for the first time, seemed to move more slowly between the drawers, her hands lingering a moment longer on each occupant's chest before she closed them away. Outside, Belgrave Lane thawed into mud and green shoots, and the neighbors greeted the couple with the same trusting smiles. But beneath the house, in the cool, corrected air of the cellar, there was a new understanding. Perfection was not eternal. It had to be fought for, one breath at a time. The fire began in a way that no one in Belgrave Lane would ever call suspicious. It was a common thing in 1907 when homes lit themselves by gas lamps and wires were strung carelessly through timber walls. It started, according to the neighbors, with a faint glow in the Eastman's upper study late one autumn night. A faulty wire, they said, a spark that caught the dry curtains and spread downward with a quiet hunger. But for Harold and Agnes, who were awake at the time, it was not merely a fire. It was an event that would alter the fate of everything they had built below the floor. Agnes was the first to smell it. She woke Harold, and together they stood at the edge of their bedroom, watching the shadows pulse red against the doorframe. The smoke was already sliding under the threshold, carrying with it the bitter tang of burning varnish. Harold's first thought was not of escape, but of the cellar. He knew the ledgers, the drawers, the bodies that had not survived. All of it could not withstand discovery should the firemen arrive in time to save the house. For the first time in years, his hand shook as he pulled on his trousers and reached for the iron key. Agnes stopped him at the stair. "No," she said, calm even as the crack of timber split the air. "The house will finish it for us." She did not mean safety, she meant cleansing. And Harold, in his rare moment of hesitation, understood. The fire would destroy everything. The walls that held their silence, the drawers that bore witness, the ledgers that spelled out their truth. It was a loss, yes, but also a salvation. They moved quickly but without panic. Agnes gathered only her small box of keepsakes, photographs, a brooch from her mother, while Harold took the parish ledger and the household accounts. The rest was left behind. They stepped into the night just as the roof above the study gave way, spilling flame into the sky like a signal. Neighbors ran barefoot from their houses, clutching coats and lanterns, their cries carrying down the lane. Some tried to help, forming a line with buckets from the pump, but the blaze had already taken the upper floors. Within an hour, the Eastman residence was a skeleton of brick and cinder, its fine windows shattered, its polished wood reduced to embers. The fire brigade arrived too late to save anything of the interior. They poured water over the smoking shell until steam rose in ghostly sheets. By dawn, nothing remained of the Eastman home but blackened walls and a smoking foundation. The neighbors clucked their tongues in pity, speaking of the tragedy of good people losing so fine a house. The vicar visited to assure Harold and Agnes that the parish would help them recover, that their generosity to the orphanage and the church would not be forgotten. Not a single person asked about the cellar, and indeed, there was no cellar to inspect. When Harold returned days later to walk the ruin, he found the floor above the hidden chamber had collapsed, smothering it under tons of debris. The cedar drawers had burned to ash, their brass pulls melted into unrecognizable lumps. The pipes had burst in the heat, flooding the pit with a thick slurry of water and soot that obliterated anything lime had not already erased. The white room, too, had been consumed, its lime-washed walls now flaking black. Even the cupboard of ceramic jars, carefully labeled and stacked, had shattered into shards under the heat. The ledger, though, remained because Harold had taken it. Tucked under his coat that night, hidden among the innocuous household accounts, it had escaped the blaze intact. In the eyes of the town, the fire was a cruel misfortune, but one that revealed the Eastmans' character. They bore their loss with composure, speaking only of gratitude that no lives had been taken. They accepted the temporary shelter of a neighbor's guest room, then relocated to a smaller house in the next parish, where they continued their church-going, their charities, their careful routines. They were pitied, admired, even celebrated for their endurance. Not a whisper of suspicion touched them. For Harold and Agnes, the fire was both an ending and a beginning. The old cellar was gone, its evidence erased, but the method lived on, in Harold's ledger, in Agnes's calm rituals, in the habits they carried with them like second skin. The house on Belgrave Lane had been reduced to ash, but its silence had not. It had only shifted, waiting for new walls in which to root itself again. By the time the century had turned twice over, Belgrave Lane had changed beyond recognition. The horse carts were gone, replaced by motor cars. The orchards had been cut back to make way for new houses, and the lane itself, once narrow and cloaked in ivy, was paved in neat black stone. The Eastman residence no longer stood. Its shell had been demolished after the fire, and in its place rose a modest post-war home of concrete and plaster, built with none of the dignity of the old brick house. Generations had passed. The name Eastman was little more than a footnote in parish records, associated only with charity, never with suspicion. But houses, like soil, do not forget. In the spring of 1974, the property's new owner decided to expand the basement. Builders were hired to break through one of the foundation walls, intending to carve out storage space for wine. Their hammers rang against brick that sounded hollower than expected. When the first section gave way, what spilled out was not stone or soil, but a dry, stale gust of air that had been trapped for nearly 70 years. Behind the wall lay a corridor, whitewashed and remarkably intact, though brittle with age. At its end, the builders discovered a chamber lined with the remnants of drawers, charred, warped, but still bearing brass pulls that clung stubbornly to their fittings. Inside the drawers was what froze the workmen in their tracks. Not intact bodies, the fire had erased too much for that, but fragments. Charcoal-colored bones curled into childlike shapes, teeth gleaming faintly where enamel had resisted flame, scraps of fabric bleached and fused into brittle ash. In some, traces of lavender still clung, a scent that drifted eerily into the dust-filled air. The workers fled the chamber white-faced and called the authorities. Within hours, the site was swarmed by police, parish officials, and eventually journalists. The investigation that followed sent ripples far beyond Belgrave Lane. Forensic specialists confirmed that the remains belonged to children, though exact numbers could not be determined. Some drawers contained more than one set of remains, suggesting reuse or burial after failure. The lime pit in the orchard, unearthed with careful shovels, yielded more. Bones whitened and brittle, buried deep in layers that told a story of repetition across years. Parish records were consulted, and though names could not be directly matched, discrepancies in the orphanage's books pointed clearly to a pattern. Children had indeed vanished into the Eastman household, never to return. The story broke in newspapers with headlines that stunned the country. The House of Drawers, one paper called it. The Belgrave Horrors, another. Reporters combed through archives, piecing together the public image of Harold and Agnes Eastman, respected, charitable, above suspicion, and setting it against the revelations of the Cellar. The contradiction fascinated and horrified in equal measure. That such cruelty could exist beneath the mask of virtue unsettled even those who had never heard the Eastmans' names before. Public outcry was immediate. Orphanage practices long ignored came under fierce scrutiny. The government was pressed into reforming child welfare policies, introducing stricter oversight, better record-keeping, and regular inspections of foster placements. Laws were amended to ensure that no child could vanish into a private household without trace. Memorials were erected, small at first, plaques and modest stones. But eventually, on the site of the orchard, a formal monument was raised. It bore no names, only an inscription. For the children who vanished and for the silence that kept them hidden. Yet the most chilling discovery came months later, when a collector purchased a box of books at an estate sale in the next parish. Among them was a leather-bound ledger labeled Observations. Its pages, miraculously preserved, contained Harold's meticulous records. The entries corroborated what investigators had pieced together but revealed far more. The methods, the failures, the deliberate refinement of cruelty disguised as preservation. The ledger was entered into evidence, but its contents were so disturbing that only excerpts were ever made public. The rest was sealed in the archives, locked away from general view. In the end, the Eastmans had long since died, their bodies laid in respectable graves, their reputations intact until the ruin of their secrets. They were beyond justice, but their cellar spoke for them at last, and the voices it carried were those of the children they had silenced. For Belgrave Lane, the discovery left a permanent scar. The new homeowners abandoned the property, unable to remain in a place that had held so much quiet suffering. The house was eventually demolished, the land left empty as though the earth itself had chosen not to bear another foundation upon that soil. The legacy of the Eastmans was no longer one of charity. It was one of secrecy, of methodical cruelty hidden in plain sight. Their story, once uncovered, became a warning that echoed far beyond their small corner of the world. Evil thrives not in chaos, but in quiet beneath the mask of order and care. The unsealing of the Eastman's secret forced a reckoning that went beyond the parish, beyond Belgrave Lane, and even beyond the children whose lives had been erased in silence. It raised a question that no law, no investigation, no archive could ever fully answer. How could such evil survive undetected for so long, wearing the face of care? The answer lay not only in the cellar, but in the way Harold and Agnes Eastman had lived above it. They were polite, orderly, and generous. They gave to the church, spoke kindly to neighbors, and kept their voices measured. Nothing in their outward lives ever betrayed the horror beneath. Their cruelty did not announce itself with violence or bloodshed. It slipped quietly into the gaps where trust replaced scrutiny. Evil in their hands had learned to mimic mercy. Harold's ledger was not filled with rage or hatred, but with cold notes about temperature, breath, and silence. Agnes's lullabies were not songs of comfort, but instruments of compliance. What they did was not the work of passion, but of method. Cruelty refined until it wore the mask of discipline, preservation, and order. Theirs was a horror that grew not from chaos, but from control. That was what unsettled the public most when the truth emerged. These were not monsters in the shape of outcasts. They were the very image of respectability. The societal impact of the discovery was lasting. Child welfare reform deepened across Britain with stricter record-keeping, unannounced inspections, and the eventual closure of several orphanages that had been operating in shadowed corners of society. The story of the Eastmans was cited in debates, held up as evidence that neglect was not always loud, that cruelty could thrive in homes that appeared clean and well-run. It taught lawmakers and inspectors to look not only for bruises and rags, but for the quieter signs. Children unaccounted for, records that did not match, neighbors who never saw the children they were told lived nearby. The Eastman cellar had become an unwanted teacher. But beyond policy there remained the philosophical wound. Evil, the Eastmans showed, does not always live in violence or passion. It often hides in silence, in obedience, in the calm routines that no one questions. It wears the same face as kindness until the mask is lifted, and by then it has already done its work. Their cellar was not simply a chamber of drawers. It was a mirror held up to society, showing how easily trust can be weaponized when no one dares to look beneath the surface. Even today, those who study the case speak not of the horror of what was found, but of what was not. There were no screams recorded in the parish, no missing child posters nailed to posts, no neighbors who admitted to suspicion. The greatest cruelty was not just the drawers themselves, but the silence that surrounded them. A silence maintained by everyone who chose to believe in appearances. At the Orchard Memorial, visitors leave flowers, toys, and small notes addressed to no one in particular. Some write the names of children lost in their own time, linking the past to the present in ways both personal and haunting. The monument stands as more than a remembrance. It is a warning. The inscription carved into its stone does not speak of the Eastmans at all. It speaks only of absence, for those who vanished into silence. As the documentary closes, the question lingers for the viewer. What protects us now from evils that hide in quiet hands? Laws may change, oversight may strengthen, but the nature of cruelty remains the same. It thrives in places where no one looks too closely, in people who appear too good to doubt. The Eastmans are long gone, their house reduced to ash, but their legacy endures as a reminder that horror does not always come with fire and blood. Sometimes it comes with lavender oil, lullabies, and the steady tick of a metronome in the dark. And so the story ends not with their destruction, but with our reflection. What do you think? Could it happen again, here, now, in the silence of another well-kept home?